Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and this video is something that I decided to do as a result of a poll that I took a while ago about what you, the audience, wanted to be my next video. And I gave you a few options, and this one was a close runner-up. This is a video on the Black Lodge. So the term Black Lodge in popular culture was probably popularised by the series directed by David Lynch, known as Twin Peaks, in which the Black Lodge features as the main antagonists, these kind of sinister entities that are having a nefarious influence on the world. And this is the idea that's presented in Twin Peaks, and Twin Peaks does have a lot of good hidden occult messages in it and occult secrets. David Lynch seems to have been tapped into something. He was very into transcendental meditation, so at the very least he understands the consciousness aspect of some of this. But anyway, a lot of occult themes hidden in there, and one of them is the existence of the Black Lodge and this sort of struggle that's going on between the Black Lodge and the White Lodge. However, this idea of the Black Lodge that makes its way into Twin Peaks is based on an idea that presented itself in the Western esoteric tradition, was particularly popular around the late 19th, early 20th century in various Western esoteric schools. And the idea in those schools is a little bit different to what's presented in Twin Peaks. So I'm going to cover that tonight. What these esoteric teachings say about the Black Lodge. And I'm going to divide this video into two parts. First, I'm going to identify the Black Lodge, which is a very real force in the world of the occult, although commonly misunderstood. And then the second part of this video is going to be all about how can we resist the Black Lodge in its attempts to hold humanity down. So that's what you've got to look forward to tonight. But before I go any further, there's a couple of things I want to bring to your attention. There's a couple of things that I've done over the last little while, which are now available for people online. So the first thing that I've done is an interview with Andrew Arnett, who's a paranormal investigator, a writer for New Dawn magazine, and he interviewed me for an article, following up on a previous article that he had done covering the esoteric side of UAP. And it's going to become an article in New Dawn magazine, but there's also video footage that he's put on his YouTube channel, a video format of that interview. So I'll leave a link to that in the description below if you want to check that out. And we talk about UAP and the occult and all different ways that those worlds intersect. And another thing that I've done recently is I had the great honour of appearing on Matthew Brown's first ever live stream. Yes, it's official. Matthew Brown and I are in contact with one another. And on this occasion, we have collaborated. On Halloween night, Matthew held a live stream on his channel, Invisible Frontiers, and spoke to a lot of people. Pavel from Psychoactivo, Josh from Polarity, two quite well-known UAP podcasters, together with Matthew himself, very much friends of this channel. And there was a surprise appearance by Dylan Borland as well, another whistleblower, on that live stream. So there's a lot of stuff in there. And the segment with me and Matthew, we're doing a tarot reading to try and get some insight into the situation with 3i Atlas. So that's quite an interesting little experiment. If you wanted to go watch that, I'll leave a link to the recording of that live stream in the description below as well. Now, back to the video. So what can we say about this idea of the Black Lodge? The first thing we need to think about is how the Black Lodge is often defined in opposition to another group, which is known as the White Lodge, also referred to as the Great White Brotherhood, also referred to as the Secret Chiefs. And this group is a group of enlightened masters, in some instances ascended masters, who are kind of directing human evolution from behind the scenes to try and elevate us in consciousness and promote our spiritual evolution and promote unity between us and unity with God, and promote values such as altruism and compassion, and generally work for the benefit of the human race. And in opposition to them, there's the Black Lodge, who are the black magicians who want to enslave humanity effectively, who want to thwart the plans of the White Lodge for their own nefarious ends. And so this sort of dualistic conflict is set up between the White Lodge and the Black Lodge. That's how this story gets set up, particularly in the late 19th century sources and the earlier part of the early 20th century. So some of the people who spoke about this include Alice Bailey from the Theosophical Society. Alice Bailey spoke about how the Black Lodge is associated with materialism. And I don't mean materialism as in like wanting to buy lots of stuff that we don't actually need. I mean, that's a part of it, but materialism in the sense of seeing the material world, the densest part of reality, is the most important part of reality, almost trying to keep humanity trapped in just an awareness of that material reality and nothing outside of that. It's about making everything dense. It's about raising materiality up as the be-all and end-all, and actually looking to the intellect as what should be the great organizing principle of human life, the cold intellect rather than the spirit, and being motivated by love. So for Alice Bailey, that was the main difference between the White Lodge and the Black. More broadly within Theosophy, the Black Lodge is seen as favouring forms of spiritual egoism, the primacy of the individual above all else, and the separation of the individual from everything and everybody else. A very individualistic, very egoistic form of spirituality, very similar to what would be described today as the left-hand path. But, you know, not just in an edgy way of like liking rebellious literary figures from the Romantic period, but actually really wanting to go against the grain of universal order and harmony. Serious Satanists. So it's against unification with divinity, and it's against having consideration or care for other people, because it's all about the separate individual. In the Mahatma letters, Master Kuthumi talks about how there's these black magicians from the Black Lodge who want to keep humanity in their place, keep them ignorant, and how they oppose the White Lodge, who are dedicated to the spiritual evolution of humanity. These are magicians who want to use spiritual powers developed through spiritual advancement, but then to turn those around as a means of dominating and enslaving others. So something goes wrong at some point on their path of spiritual development for them to develop in that direction. The Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, another late 19th century group, saw the Black Lodge as working with forms of black magic, such as necromancy. Black magic, most broadly defined, can be anything which is focused only on the material needs of the person, not the greater spiritual needs, or which is selfishly motivated, but more often than not, it is specifically like harmful magic. So we're seeing some common themes here emerge regarding the nature of the Black Lodge and what their kind of teachings and philosophy is. This spiritual egoism, this thinking of oneself as separate from the rest of humanity and in fact above the rest of humanity, so a kind of elitism. There's a hint as to who some of the members of this Black Lodge might be. And of course, materialism, being a worshipper of the intellect rather than the spirit, and wanting to use cities or powers that are developed after a certain level of spiritual development in order to dominate others. And we see this idea emerging that spiritual advancement is not just about becoming more and more enlightened, because not all spiritual practices are connected to a particular framework of morality centered around compassion. There are, of course, left-hand path spiritual philosophies, and you can gain supernatural powers and skills in certain types of magic without having a moral compass that directs that, just the same as with technology. We're a very immoral species, and yet we're technologically very advanced. And so a master of the Black Lodge is someone who is spiritually developed in that direction. And so at this point we have what the sources say about the Black Lodge. The mind starts to fill in the blanks of what this organized group of black magicians might look like, and we get the kind of caricature of an evil organization or an evil council, like a shadowy council that sits behind the scenes of world affairs and wants to dominate the world, wants to enslave the human race, and are using dark, sinister powers in order to do that. There are indeed manifestations of the Black Lodge in our world today which do fit that description, or at least try really hard to fit that description, but that's not a representation of the entire Black Lodge. In fact, at its core, what the Black Lodge is, it's any individual or group or groups of people that are united by a particular mindset or philosophy when it comes to spirituality, which is that egoism and that misuse of spirituality in order to try and control people, and seeing oneself as set apart, and having that nefarious influence, dividing oneself against others, dividing the world into us and them, in groups and out groups, and then trying to get power over those who are in the out group. It is more or less how the Black Lodge operates. So any group, any lodge within a secret society or an order, it could be something as simple as like an occult book club or book circle that can deteriorate into a Black Lodge if there's like a cult-like narcissistic leader at the center of it who's trying to silence all of those who are critical of them. So it's a very broad definition indeed. And it's not necessarily like there's this grand conspiracy that unites all these groups, but they are very much united by the same mentality, let's say. And I should say as well, it's not even limited to spiritual groups, because in this modern day and age, there are a lot of philosophies and a lot of ideologies that are actually very much based in science and materialism, and yet they kind of have a lot of features of a religion. So the most obvious one is of course communism, and particularly when you think about how a feature of the Black Lodge, according to Alice Bailey, was putting that emphasis on the material and almost like trying to get humanity bogged down in the material, means even more so that the manifestations of the Black Lodge might not be overtly spiritual. It could be a group of secular philosophers, it could be a group of scientists, it could be a group of aspiring technocrats, very, very much so, as manifestations of this Black Lodge. But even in a spiritual philosophy like Thelema, which sometimes gets described as a satanic philosophy by very unsophisticated people, even something like Thelema has an idea of the White Brotherhood and the Black Brotherhood. When Thelema talks about the Black Brotherhood, it's not necessarily exactly the same idea as when Theosophists, for example, talk about the Black Lodge, because the Black Brotherhood was often spoken about specifically to do with the ordeal of the crossing of the abyss and what would happen if a person tried that and then failed. But there have been other times when the Black Brotherhood has been used as a more general expression by the likes of Crowley, and it seems to be the same or a similar concept to the Black Lodge. Let's look a bit more closely at the Thelemic idea of the Black Brotherhood, because this gives us a few more interesting details. So, as I said, the Black Brotherhood is a group of those adepts on the path who got as far as being ready to cross the abyss. So very advanced spiritual practitioners, and attempted the crossing of the abyss. Now, if you don't know what the crossing of the abyss is, it is a initiation, a very advanced level of initiation, which is where you have to surrender your entire ego-based personality and have that dissolved in the abyss so that you can be reborn on the other side of the abyss in the supernal triads on the tree of life here, which is beyond the world of duality, the world of manifest reality, and also beyond the ego. And so your personality gets reconstituted, but you've kind of seen beyond the illusion of selfhood. And if you are going through the ordeal of the abyss and you can't let go of your selfhood, you can't let go of your ego in some way, you can't fully surrender, then you get stuck in the false sephira of Dart, and then you mistake your delusions of yourself as visions of some transcendental God. And so you come back from the ordeal of the abyss thinking that your ego is God and acting like all people in human history who have had that delusion act. And so you become a menace to everybody around you. And that failure to cross the abyss puts you on this sort of downward spiral. Eventually you just disintegrate in the world of the Qliphoth, you know, the empty shells on the negative side of the tree. So not a very good fate at all. And again, we get a similar kind of image in our head as when the likes of Alice Bailey talk about the Black Lodge. But when Crowley applied the label of the Black Brotherhood to people, he often applied it in quite surprising ways. Another way that he would often refer to the Black Brotherhood is using it as a label for Christianity. He said that Christianity was the Black Brotherhood. I couldn't find the source where he says that, but I know for certain that he has said that before. And so quite the contrary to what we imagine as like a evil, satanic organization, he's actually saying that it's the representatives of the light that are the Black Brotherhood from his point of view. And perhaps that gives you a little bit of insight into Crowley's own personal spiritual philosophy. But there is this kind of notion that we're invited to contemplate in the way that Crowley talks about the Black Brotherhood, where appearances can be deceiving, and perhaps those who claim to represent the light are in fact the true Black Brotherhood, and that perhaps it's not so much about good versus evil, but about, if we're talking about those who see themselves as separate from the rest of humanity and the rest of creation, then perhaps it's more about consciousness that is stuck below the abyss versus the consciousness that can surrender to the higher reality above the abyss, where things are a lot more non-dual. And that distinction will become important as we explore the ramifications of the idea of the Black Brotherhood and some of the misconceptions that can arise to do with it that actually feed the Black Brotherhood. And so now a challenge emerges as we speak about this topic, because we live in an inherently dualistic universe, and we have an inherently dualistic way of thinking as human beings. When we talk about how we're dualistic, that often carries negative implications in the way it's spoken about, but it is just the reality of our existence. It's not necessarily something to be ashamed of. The Taoists, for example, recognize that our reality, the way that we interact with reality, the way that we categorize reality, is very dualistic. There was no moral judgment placed upon that. It just is the way that it is. You could think of duality as like our programming language for making sense of the world. We think in terms of up and down, black and white, left and right, and so forth. But I think there is a qualitative difference between setting up a duality, good versus evil, like these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, and that is as simple as it is, and that is absolute, versus dualism versus non-dualism. And holding that tension between dualism and non-dualism in your head, and perhaps even preferring non-dualism will get you closer to union with the divine and understanding the divine than falling into this really dogmatic and black and white, goodies versus baddies type of paradigm. So as I said earlier, the way that Philemon talks about the Black Lodge or the Black Brotherhood has a lot more subtlety to it than some of the older versions of this idea. And it invites us to think about certain groups of people being manifestations of the Black Lodge that we might not otherwise think of. So, you know, the most common image of the Black Lodge is like the Satanist in the black robe looming over the top of you with their athame, ready to make their offering to Satan and all of this sort of thing, like an Iron Maiden song. But that's often not the way that the Black Lodge manifests itself. I mean, those people definitely exist, and it's not just a satanic panic to say that. But there is this also more subtle version of the Black Lodge, which is honestly the one that you're more likely to encounter in your life. And it's evil disguised as good. For instance, you know, it could be the wellness coach who's hired by your soulless corporate job to come teach everybody mindfulness. Use that mindfulness practice to numb themselves to the fact that they're being exploited by their corporate masters. But it's all dressed up in this kind of fluffy, feel-good packaging, although it's something very sinister going on. The Black Lodge could manifest in your life as the evangelical preacher who is in one of those mega churches and comes to the pulpit parachuting down with pyrotechnics and lighting and everything else, making a big song and dance about the fact that they're coming to minister, and spends all the obscene amount of money that the church makes on vanities such as that, rather than giving it to the poor, and preaches that if somebody has a lot of money, it's because God is rewarding them, and that's how God rewards those that he loves just a little bit more. That's a manifestation of the Black Lodge. They'll tell you that they are saved, that they are representatives of the Lord, but they are in fact a manifestation of the Black Lodge. Or perhaps it's the New Age guru who has mistaken self-indulgent physical comfort and laziness for the cultivation of a spiritual inner peace and harmony, and so discourages people from putting themselves through challenging situations, because to put yourself in those difficult life situations will be to invite negative energy or low vibrational thinking into your life, and it's better to just exist in this privileged solipsism that has been carefully crafted by the guru. That is a manifestation of the Black Lodge. And we see many examples of a spiritual doctrine that is actually taking people in a negative direction of development, even though it may superficially seem good. Like they say, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. But of course, there is very in-your-face, very overt evil as well that can manifest itself, such as, you know, when people are overcome with a spirit that motivates them to gleefully celebrate the unaliving of a father and a husband, for no other reason than they share different opinions. Such actions and such attitudes would obviously seem evil to any well-adjusted, mentally healthy person. And quite often when we are faced with this real evil that does pop up from time to time, increasingly so in this day and age it seems, we must confront it. We can't just take a live and let live approach, because then it will devour us. And so we're faced with this fact. We don't want to get caught up in, you know, rigid dichotomies of good versus evil, but evil does exist and we need to do something about it. So how do we handle that situation? We do need to deal with it, but the methods that we use to deal with it and the attitudes that we adopt as we're trying to deal with it can be a trap. And they can be things which actually drag us down, and that desire to fight back can be used by the Black Lodge to drag us down to their level and bring us under their thumb. And so the second half of this video, which will begin now, is going to be about how we can effectively resist the Black Lodge without falling into its snares. Now at this point, I think it's worth me saying there's a lot of lessons that I will share in this part of the video that are applicable to the more general problem of confronting evil, not necessarily just the Black Lodge specifically, although I think that a video on the Black Lodge is a good opportunity to have that broader discussion about how we face evil, because when we're talking about the Black Lodge, we're covering themes such as, you know, what appears to be a dualistic struggle between good and evil, but might actually turn out to be a struggle against dualism itself. An ironic situation that sees even the traditional crusaders of good recast as yet another manifestation of evil. And let's just keep that in mind as we move forward in this topic. So for this part of the video, I'd like to set the scene for the remainder of the video with an anecdote from my own spiritual life. So there was a time a couple of years ago now where I was involved in a modern Gnostic group. And, you know, it had its flaws, don't get me wrong, but there were a lot of people in there that were serious about the spiritual path and had a zeal for it that I haven't really seen in many other places. There are some people that I knew in this movement who were Gnostic missionaries who would teach this modern form of Gnosticism to a class. And one of the missionaries that I knew, who I had great respect for, he was speaking to us one night, and he was relaying what he had learned about the Black Lodge and how they were operating in our world today. And he said something which has stuck with me ever since, which is that the state that society currently finds itself in is due to the fact that there are two rival factions of the Black Lodge which are at war with each other. And that war is determining the direction of the culture. With the level of polarization in society and the way that society is polarized, it didn't take a lot of thinking to figure out who the two sides were, who the two factions of the Black Lodge were. And so that is the situation that we find ourselves to this day, and even more so today. And it's been a very emotionally charged couple of months because of events that have been going on in the world. People are more divided than ever before, going all in to support everything that the left does or everything that the right does in a quite tribalistic and rigid way. And yet in the midst of all of this, the US sitting on the brink of civil war and cultural war across the Western world in every other respect, there have been a few people, minority voices, calling for us to look beyond the duality of left versus right, good versus evil, black versus white. They've even encouraged us to realize that we may be divided against ourselves on purpose by those who are in power, to weaken us so that we can't stand up for our rights as a collective species. And I think that there are merits to all of those points, and I agree with all of those sentiments. However, I would add a caveat of my own, which is that it's possible for someone to look beyond these us versus them type of paradigms that are operating, good versus evil, black versus white, blah, blah, blah. But in doing so, in looking beyond them or transcending them, they detach themselves from the world completely. And then that creates danger, because in many instances there is a kernel of truth. When there's alarm or panic about a group of people and what they might do, there's a kernel of truth to that. There's a very real danger there. It might be exaggerated. The threat might be applied to too broad a group of people, but it is there, and we can't ignore it, because if we do, we fall victim to it. If you think of soldiers who are responsible for guarding a city, if they see an army approaching and they know that the intention of that army is to completely destroy the city, those soldiers know they can't simply afford to ignore the army simply because they don't want to be drawn into a dualistic battle. Because if they do that, the next thing you know, they've dropped their defenses. The barbarians have breached the gate and it's game over. So that's just not a solution. There has to be a third option where we find a way of confronting evil once we've identified it, without falling into the trap of black and white dualistic thinking. And that's what I'm going to discuss now. But before we go any deeper into this, there's another characteristic of the Black Lodge that we need to be aware of, which is also a feature of the demonic realm as well, which is that the Black Lodge can take the negative feelings that it provokes in others and use those feelings to feed itself. There's a couple of ways that this manifests. It can be understood in the most obvious sense of provoking fear in people in order to feed off the fear and use that as a resource to unlock some hidden experience not normally available to human beings, which is seen as a source of power in some sick way. We've seen this in the context of some of the psi experiments that were conducted by the US government. More and more information on this is starting to come out now. And it's also hinted at in Twin Peaks with the strange substance known as garmonbozia that the entities of the Black Lodge consume. There is another important sense in which dark entities can harness negative feelings in order to feed themselves. And I don't think that this gets spoken about enough. And what I'm talking about here is when negative entities or people motivated by negative energies compel us to react to their attacks upon us by becoming more like them, so that their negativity becomes contagious. When something or someone motivated by the dark realm attacks you, it creates a temptation for you to abandon the moral high ground and stoop to their level when you make the counterattack. This in turn breeds more negativity. And this is also how the empire is able to reproduce itself, according to the writings of Phillip K Dick. I talk about this a bit in my video on the Black Iron Prison, which I'll link in the description below if I remember to do so, because it's a bit of a case study which overlaps with some of the themes I'm talking about tonight. And a good visualization of how dark entities can inspire and then feed off of negativity in other people, particularly in the form of anger in this instance, is by thinking about the dark planet in the fifth element, this sort of manifestation of the ultimate evil, which wants to destroy the world. And when the protagonists are first faced with this evil, the first people that come up against it are these kind of military people who very much, are the warriors, very much represent the forces of the world, of political and military power, and probably motivated by fear and identifying threats. And their approach to trying to stop the dark planet is by firing their weapons of war at it. And when they do that, the entity grows. It actually feeds off of those weapons that are fired into it. And the dark planet is eventually blasted into oblivion, but the force that is behind that is love, rather than what was motivating these military people. And there's an important lesson in that. There's a lot of important lessons like that in The Fifth Element. Another film which has got a lot of esoteric knowledge hidden within it. And the lesson in this instance is on confronting evil motivated by love rather than by fear or hate. And what's even more dangerous is if you've got two sides of a conflict where both sides represent the force of darkness, and then you've got a self-amplifying feedback loop of negativity, and the negativity just gets louder and louder, kind of like what the world has been like ever since social media, like really took off in 2014 or around then. So how then do we defeat the forces of evil, and by extension the Black Lodge? Not just by identifying what the Black Lodge is, what evil is, but by knowing how to deal with it and its attacks. We can't allow them to set the rules of engagement, because then we allow the conditions for evil to reproduce itself. The first step is to be motivated by some positive vision in what you're trying to do in life, rather than prescribing to a worldview that is about opposing something that you don't like. And then you make that positive vision the most important focus of your life. And you have that as the thing that motivates you, rather than a feeling of powerlessness, which breeds resentment and then causes us to constantly focus on what we don't have and blame someone else for us not having that. And when we have a positive purpose, like I described, we will feel whole, stable and satisfied, and be less likely to veer into extremes of behavior that cause instability. So that really needs to be the starting point. The first line of defense is to establish that way of life when we're talking about how we can defend ourselves against the Black Lodge. So we embrace this paradigm of wholeness and balance and alignment with higher principles, we're much less likely to get swept up in a kind of divisive, hateful, resentful narrative about us versus the others. And when we cultivate this attitude, we find ourselves going through life looking for peace rather than conflict. But if something does come in from the dark realm which tries to interfere with our peace, then we need to acknowledge it, the reality of it, that it's happening, and then know how to respond correctly. If we have a positive vision that motivates us, we will fight to defend what is good. And that will become a more important driver of our actions than simply making sure the other person loses. And so this allows us to engage in situations of conflict when we need to, while still remaining level-headed and still adhering to moral principles. And we used to have a much better idea of this, particularly in Japanese society. They had the ideal of the code of Bushido that the samurai used to follow. And in the Western world, we had the code of chivalry that knights were, at least in theory, supposed to follow. These are examples of how you can be a warrior and still adhere to a moral code. And this is how we can set ourselves up to resist evil with mindfulness. Sometimes we will misjudge the response that we should have, and we will have too much severity in how we respond to the people that are motivated by the forces of evil. But that happens, we're human. The key is to always try and improve, and just by all means not get drawn into this endless cycle, this endless downward spiral of two sides wanting revenge on each other, and making the other side suffer more than you've already been suffered, and the back and forth of that. We should be trying to solve a problem rather than satisfying a desire to get back at someone, a desire driven by unregulated passion and emotion. We need to know that there's real evil out there, but we need to be equally vigilant about the evil within ourselves. Otherwise, we will see ourselves as the good guys, and we'll be blindsided to the evil we carry within and think all the actions that we take against the external evil are justified. And then it's a slippery slope to justifying atrocities against other people, because they're the evil ones and we're the good ones. Conversely, we need to refrain from using the label of evil to dehumanize people, which is a similar point. Even the person who has made the most evil decisions is still a human being and still deserves to be treated like a human being. They still have a right to a fair trial, to humane conditions if they are detained somewhere, and so on. And on some occasions it will leave a bitter taste in our mouths having to adhere to those principles, but we must adhere to them nonetheless. Sometimes making the moral choice is extremely uncomfortable, but we need to do it anyway, because that is the way to moving towards a better way of being. That is the way of moving towards being a more spiritually evolved species. And because having these kinds of attitudes is really the thing that separates us from someone who is part of or under the influence of the Black Lodge. So that's my video identifying the Black Lodge and ways that we can resist the Black Lodge. I hope that you found this informative. If you did enjoy the video, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel to support my work, and make sure you ring the notification bell, because YouTube sometimes doesn't tell people that I've got new videos, and sometimes because of the subject matters that I speak about, YouTube censors me by not promoting my videos properly. Another manifestation of the Black Lodge at work, perhaps. But there's other ways you can support me too. You can hit join or thanks down below, and also I'll leave a link to my merch store. This is an example of the kind of merch that I'm selling there. You can support me further that way. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.